Eleanor Harris bent over her garden, the sunlight filtering through the leaves of the towering oak tree that provided a gentle shade over her beloved patch of earth. At 78, Eleanor found solace in the simple act of cultivating her flowers and vegetables. The vibrant hues of marigolds and petunias danced in the breeze, while the scent of freshly turned soil filled her lungs, bringing her a sense of peace that was hard to find elsewhere. With each weed she pulled and every seed she planted, she felt a connection to the earth, a grounding force in her otherwise quiet life. "Just a little more water for you, my beauties," she murmured to her plants, a smile spreading across her weathered face. Her hands, lined with age, moved deftly as she tended to her garden, a small oasis in the middle of her quaint town. The sound of chirping birds and the rustling leaves created a symphony of tranquility, punctuated only by the occasional laughter from her neighbors, who were enjoying the last rays of a warm afternoon. As she stood back to admire her handiwork, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the simple pleasures of her life: weekly card games with her friends, the warmth of a cup of chamomile tea in the evenings, and the occasional visit from her grandchildren. Yet even in this peaceful existence, a flicker of discontent sparked within her. The world beyond her garden felt distant, and she often pondered the lives of her relatives, particularly her great-uncle William, who had lived a life shrouded in mystery. She barely remembered him, a shadowy figure from her childhood, but the stories her mother had shared lingered in her mind. Later that evening, Eleanor gathered with her friends around a worn wooden table, the familiar atmosphere of their weekly card game enveloping her like a warm blanket. The clinking of glasses and the sound of laughter filled the air, creating a comforting backdrop to the evening. Sally, her closest friend, leaned in with a mischievous grin. "Eleanor, do you remember the time you tried to bluff your way through poker? You look like a deer caught in headlights." Eleanor chuckled, recalling the moment vividly. "I was terrified. I thought I would faint right there. I had no idea what I was doing." The group erupted into laughter, the kind that echoed through the room and warmed their hearts. As the game progressed, talk of family inevitably drifted into the conversation. "You know, I've never really felt close to my relatives," Eleanor confessed, her fingers shuffling the cards absent-mindedly. "Especially that great-uncle William. I hardly knew him, and yet it feels like there's a whole world of stories I've missed out on." "William? That old coot? I heard he was quite the character," Sally responded, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "Didn't he have a fortune? They say he was a businessman of some sort." "Something like that," Eleanor replied, a hint of nostalgia in her voice. "He lived in the city while we stayed here. I remember my mother speaking of him with a mix of admiration and disdain. I suppose it's too late to learn more now." The conversation shifted to lighter subjects, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her great-uncle's life than mere stories. As the evening wore on and laughter subsided, she felt a peculiar longing to understand her roots, to dig deeper into the family history that felt so fragmented. That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, her mind wandered back to William. "What was your life like?" she whispered into the stillness of her room. She tucked herself under the covers, hoping for dreams that might reveal the secrets of her past. The next morning, just as the sun began to rise, Eleanor's peaceful routine was abruptly interrupted by the shrill ring of her phone. She groaned, reaching for it with a sense of dread. Who could it be so early in the day? The voice on the other end was formal and steady, introducing himself as Mr. Thompson, a lawyer. "Mrs. Harris, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his tone clipped yet respectful. "I have some important news regarding your great-uncle William. I need you to sit down." Eleanor's heart raced, a wave of confusion washing over her. "What new?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "William has passed away, and you are now the sole heir to his estate," Mr. Thompson explained, each word striking Eleanor like a thunderbolt. "There are significant assets left for you, and I would like to discuss the next steps." "Wait, what? An estate? I... I don't understand. Are you sure you have the right person?" Her skepticism bubbled to the surface as she tried to process the information. It felt surreal, like a scene from a movie rather than her life. "I assure you, Mrs. Harris, the information is accurate. I can provide documentation to confirm," he replied, his voice unwavering. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, grappling with the reality of her situation. The quiet life she had known felt threatened by this unforeseen upheaval. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'll think about it," she managed to say, her mind racing with questions yet to be formed. As she hung up, a storm of emotions churned within her, leaving her uncertain about what the future might hold. Eleanor stood in her modest kitchen, a small suitcase open on the table before her, surrounded by familiar comforts. The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on her carefully arranged collection of flower seeds and gardening tools. She had never imagined that a simple phone call could catapult her into a whirlwind of uncertainty. And yet, here she was, preparing to leave her peaceful life behind. The thought of venturing into the bustling city filled her with equal parts excitement and dread. As she packed, Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly. She picked up a photograph of her late husband, Harold, and gazed at his smiling face. "What would you think of all this, Harold?" she murmured softly. "I can't help but feel that I'm stepping into a world I don't belong to." She placed the photo back in the drawer, closed it, and took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of anxiety. "Eleanor, dear, are you ready?" called out her friend Madeline from the living room. Madeline had insisted on accompanying her to the city, believing that the moral support would ease Eleanor's transition. "Almost, Madeline. Just packing a few last things," Eleanor replied, her voice a mix of reassurance and hesitation. She carefully folded a floral blouse that reminded her of summer days spent in the garden and set it aside. The thought of facing a world of wealth and power felt daunting, but the memory of her great-uncle William lingered in her mind, an enigmatic figure she barely remembered, yet now found herself tied to by an inheritance that felt both alien and heavy with expectation. When she finally stepped outside, the air was crisp, a gentle reminder of the changing seasons. Madeline was waiting at the curb, her car gleaming in the sunlight. "You look lovely, Eleanor," she said with a warm smile, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "This is going to be an adventure." Eleanor chuckled softly, though the flutter in her stomach betrayed her feelings. "Adventure, yes, but I'd much rather be tending to my roses." As they drove towards the city, Eleanor gazed out the window, watching the scenery change from open fields to clustered buildings. The landscape morphed, and with it, her heart raced. "What if I don't like it there?" she voiced her concerns, her brows furrowing. "Then we'll make the best of it. You have to see this as an opportunity to discover more about your family, to understand William," Madeline encouraged, her tone unwavering. "It's not just about the money, Eleanor. It's about uncovering a part of yourself." Eleanor nodded, though her mind was filled with apprehensions. As they approached the city, the towering skyscrapers loomed like giants, casting long shadows over the streets, bustling with life. Eleanor felt small and out of place, a stark contrast to the tranquil life she had known. The cacophony of honking cars and the chatter of pedestrians was overwhelming. "I can't believe how different it is," she whispered, half to herself. "Just breathe, Eleanor. We'll find the law office together," Madeline reassured her, parking the car amid the chaos. "Remember, you're not alone in this." Eleanor stepped out, the noise enveloping her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. With each step, she felt the weight of her situation pressing down on her shoulders. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, scanning the street signs that seemed to dance in her vision. "Let's follow the map. It should be just a few blocks away," Madeline replied, unfolding a crumpled paper. The two women began walking, Eleanor's heart pounding as they navigated through the throngs of people, each face a stranger, each voice a reminder of how different her life had become. When they finally reached the law office, Eleanor hesitated at the door. "What if he doesn't have good news?" she questioned, her voice trembling. "Then we'll deal with it together," Madeline said, placing a reassuring hand on her back. "You're stronger than you think, Eleanor." With a deep breath, Eleanor stepped inside the office, the cool air hitting her like a wave. The receptionist smiled politely, directing them to a waiting area adorned with leather chairs and framed degrees on the walls. Eleanor's heart raced as she glanced around, feeling the weight of expectation in the air. "Mr. Thompson will see you now," the receptionist announced, breaking the silence. Eleanor's stomach nodded. "Here goes nothing," she murmured, following Madeline into the office. not knowing that this meeting would begin to unravel the threads of her life in ways she could never have imagined. Eleanor sat in the plush leather chair in Mr. Thompson's office, the polished mahogany desk between them, reflecting the golden light of the afternoon sun. The implications of her inheritance weighed heavily on her mind. "So let me get this straight," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You're telling me that my great-uncle William left me not just money, but properties, investments, and what else?" Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses, looking at her with a mix of sympathy and professionalism. "Yes, Mrs. Harris, your great-uncle amassed quite a fortune over his lifetime. This includes several properties across the city, a stake in various businesses, and investment portfolios that could set you up for life." Eleanor's heart raced. The thought of such wealth was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I don't even know how to manage that kind of money. I've spent my life tending to my garden and playing cards with friends. This, this is all so overwhelming." She looked out the window, where the bustling city life seemed to mock her quiet existence back home. "Understandably so," Mr. Thompson replied, his tone gentle. "However, it's important to note that your uncle had many unfinished projects. Some are quite ambitious, each tied to moral considerations that may conflict with your values." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "What do you mean by moral considerations?" He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "For instance, some of his investments were in industries that have raised ethical questions, like a development project that would displace a community. There are also philanthropic endeavors he never completed, including funding for a local shelter for homeless veterans." The room fell silent. Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The thought of her great-uncle's unfinished business didn't just represent opportunities, they represented choices that could hurt others. "I don't want to be responsible for harming people," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always valued kindness over wealth." Mr. Thompson nodded. "That's precisely why it's essential for you to consider each project carefully. The wealth you've inherited could be used to make a significant impact, but it also comes with the weight of your great-uncle's legacy." Taking a deep breath, Eleanor leaned forward. "What do I do now? I can't just ignore it all." "You need to evaluate your options," he suggested. "Perhaps it would be wise to speak to people involved in these projects, understand their implications, and then you can make informed decisions that align with your values." Eleanor's mind raced as she considered the possibilities. She could take the money and live comfortably, or she could engage with her great-uncle's legacy. But the latter felt daunting. "I've never dealt with anything like this before. I feel so unprepared." "You're not alone, Eleanor," Mr. Thompson reassured her. "You have the choice to seek guidance. Perhaps consulting with a financial advisor or a community leader could help you navigate this." As she left the law office, the city felt larger than life, and she was just a small speck in its vastness. With every step, she grappled with the weight of her inheritance. The sidewalks were crowded, people rushing past her, each lost in their own world. She paused for a moment, taking in the cacophony of honking cars, street vendors calling for attention, and the distant rhythm of a live band playing in a nearby park. Suddenly, she felt a pull to explore, to understand the world her great-uncle had inhabited, the very city that now belonged to her in some twisted way. The thought of visiting the properties and investments, of learning about the very projects that could change lives, filled her with a strange sense of purpose. Her heart raced as she contemplated her next steps. "I suppose it's time to find out just what I've inherited," she said aloud to herself, her voice barely audible over the city's hum. "But I have to do it right. I owe that to myself and to the people my uncle may have affected." With newfound determination, Eleanor walked forward, ready to uncover the truth about her great-uncle's legacy, even if it meant confronting moral dilemmas that made her question everything she believed. Eleanor stood at the edge of the bustling city park, her heart racing as she glanced at the towering skyscrapers surrounding her. The air was thick with the scent of street food and the sound of laughter, a stark contrast to the serene whispers of her garden back home. Just moments ago, she had met Sarah, a local journalist with an infectious enthusiasm that made Eleanor feel a flicker of hope amidst her confusion. "Are you ready to dive into the life of your great-uncle?" Sarah asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Eleanor hesitated, unsure if she was prepared for the journey ahead. "I suppose I am," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm not sure what I'll find." With that, the two women set off, navigating through the crowded streets. Sarah guided Eleanor with ease, weaving through groups of people, pointing out landmarks that held significance to William. "He was quite the character," Sarah commented casually. "People either loved him or despised him. There was no in-between." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had grown up hearing snippets about her great-uncle William, but they were just stories, tales of a man who had made a fortune but had been shunned by the family. "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "Well," Sarah began, "he was a philanthropist, but he also had his hands in some questionable businesses. I've heard rumors that he was involved in a few shady deals. People in the community had mixed feelings about him." Eleanor nodded slowly, absorbing Sarah's words. As they walked, the city's heartbeat pulsed around them, and Eleanor felt as if she were stepping into a different world, a world her great-uncle had thrived in. They arrived at a modest community center, its weathered exterior a sign of years of service. "This was one of his projects," Sarah explained. "William funded it for low-income families. It was one of the few good things he did, but it doesn't erase the past." Eleanor peered inside, her heart heavy with the weight of her great-uncle's legacy. "Did he ever visit?" she asked. "Not often," Sarah replied, her tone shifting to one of sympathy. "I think he preferred to remain in the shadows, funding things without facing the people he was helping. It's as if he wanted to contribute to society, but couldn't bear the weight of his own choices." Eleanor felt a pang of empathy for the man she barely knew. "It must have been lonely," she murmured, "to have everything but still remain a stranger to those you're trying to help." "Exactly," Sarah exclaimed, her excitement bubbling over. "There's so much to unpack here, Eleanor. We can explore more of his projects if you want. The city has stories to tell about him, both good and bad." As they continued their exploration, they visited a park named after William, a place where children played and families gathered. Eleanor watched a group of kids laughing as they chased each other, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to envision a world where her great-uncle's influence had brought joy. But then a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. If he had such wealth and power, why didn't he do more? She questioned, feeling the weight of expectation. "He was complicated," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "People often are. Sometimes they want to make a difference but end up lost in their own ambitions. It's a fine line." Eleanor sighed, her heart heavy with the realization that her great-uncle's life was a tapestry of contradictions. Just as they were about to leave, Sarah pointed to an old bookstore across the street. "Let's check that out. I've heard they have some of his old writings." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Writings?" she repeated, a flicker of hope igniting within her. "You mean, like letters or journals?" "Exactly. If we can find something personal, it might give us insight into who he really was," Sarah said, her enthusiasm infectious. As they entered the bookstore, the musty smell of old pages enveloped them. Eleanor felt a sense of comfort in the familiar scent, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions she had experienced all day. They sifted through stacks of books, and as Eleanor flipped through a battered journal, she felt a jolt of recognition. The handwriting was unmistakably her great-uncle's. "Look at this!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with excitement. "It's his diary!" Sarah leaned closer, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Let's see what he wrote." Together they began to read, and Eleanor felt as if she were peering into the soul of a man she had only known through whispers and shadows. The pages were filled with regrets, dreams unfulfilled, and a longing for connection that resonated deeply with Eleanor. "He wished he could have done more," she whispered, her heart aching with understanding. "He wanted to make amends for something." "This is powerful," Sarah murmured, flipping through the pages with delicate care. "It's not just about wealth, Eleanor. It's about legacy, choices, and the paths we take." Eleanor's mind raced. The journey into her great-uncle's life was just beginning, and as she read his words, she realized that she was on the brink of discovering not just William's story, but her own as well. Eleanor stood in the dimly lit room of her great-uncle William's estate, the air thick with the weight of history and unfulfilled desires. She clutched this diary she had discovered earlier, its pages filled with the ink of a man whose dreams had been both grand and tragic. As she began to read aloud some of the entries, a sense of purpose began to swell within her, a determination to fulfill the wishes of a man she barely knew, yet whose legacy had thrust her into a whirlwind of moral dilemmas. Each day I look out at this city and see the world through a different lens, she read, her voice trembling slightly. I have the means to make a difference, yet I find myself paralyzed by the weight of my own failures. She paused, her gaze drifting to the window, where the bustling streets of the city teemed with life, so different from her quiet town. What does it mean to truly live, Eleanor? She whispered to herself, the question echoing in her mind. Just then, the door swung open and Sarah, the journalist, stepped inside. Eleanor, we need to talk, she said, her expression a mix of urgency and concern. I've been speaking to some of William's former associates, and they have a lot to say about his legacy, and not all of it is good. Eleanor nodded, her heart racing. What do you mean? I've already faced backlash from some of the beneficiaries of his will. They're not happy that I'm considering his unfinished projects. Exactly, Sarah replied, crossing her arms. Some of these people see you as an obstacle to their access to William's wealth. They don't care about his dreams. They just want their cut. Sarah paused, her voice lowering. And it seems that William left behind more than just unfinished projects. He left a trail of broken relationships and betrayals. Eleanor's brow furrowed. What kind of betrayals are we talking about? There are stories of people he wronged, investments that turned sour because he prioritized profit over people, Sarah explained, her tone serious. One associate, a man named Victor, claims that William had a chance to make amends but chose to ignore it. Now he's looking for someone to blame, and you're the easiest target. Eleanor's heart sank. I had hoped to find something redeeming in his legacy, but it feels like I'm just unearthing more skeletons. Do you want to confront Victor? Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing. It could be a chance to understand more about who William was, and perhaps even gain insight into what you should do next. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor felt a surge of resolve. Yes, I need to hear what he has to say. I need to know if there's any truth in these accusations. The next day, they met Victor at a dimly lit cafe, the atmosphere thick with tension. Victor, a middle-aged man with sharp features and a calculating gaze, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. So you're the heir, he said, a smirk playing on his lips. I didn't expect William to leave his fortune to a distant relative. I figured he'd find someone more deserving. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine but stood firm. I'm here to understand more about my great-uncle's legacy. What do you mean by deserving? Victor leaned forward, his voice low and conspiratorial. William had a way of building people up only to tear them down when it suited him. He was ruthless in business, but he had a soft spot for those who could serve his interests. When he turned his back on those who helped him rise, he lost everything that mattered. As Eleanor listened, her heart ached with the realization that her great-uncle's life had been a complex tapestry of ambition and isolation. So you think he was just a villain? She challenged. Victor shrugged. He was a man of contradictions. He wanted to make a mark on the world, but he sacrificed relationships along the way. You're in a unique position now, Eleanor. You can either continue his legacy of greed or choose a different path. Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle heavily on her shoulders. But how do I honor a man who made so many mistakes? Victor's eyes narrowed. By learning from them. Do you want to be remembered for the wealth you inherit or the connections you forge? As Eleanor left the cafe, the sun setting behind her, the city glowed with potential. The confrontation with Victor had ignited a flame of clarity within her. She realized that her journey was about more than just fulfilling William's wishes. It was about forging her own legacy. With renewed determination, she began to envision a community event that would honor her great-uncle while also making amends for the hurt he had caused. It would be a celebration of connection, healing, and a chance to redefine what it meant to be truly wealthy. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the community park where the event was set to take place. Eleanor Harris stood on the makeshift stage, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and anxiety. The crowd had gathered, a blend of familiar faces and curious townsfolk, all awaiting the unveiling of a statue dedicated to her great-uncle William. He had been a man of contradictions, and today Eleanor hoped to honor both the complexities of his life and the legacy he had left behind. "Thank you all for being here," Eleanor began, her voice trembling slightly as she clasped her hands together. "It's a privilege to celebrate the contributions of my great-uncle William to this community. He believed in giving back, even if his methods were sometimes unconventional." A few chuckles rippled through the audience, easing her tension. As she continued, Eleanor spoke of William's philanthropic efforts, how he had funded local schools and supported struggling families. "He may not have been perfect, but he wanted to make a difference," she said, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Just as she was about to unveil the statue, a figure stepped forward from the back of the crowd, drawing everyone's attention. "Wait!" the stranger shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Eleanor's heart sank as she turned to face the unexpected interruption. The man was tall and rugged, his features partially obscured by a worn hat. "You don't know the whole story about William?" he continued, his eyes glinting with a mixture of urgency and defiance. Eleanor's breath hitched. "Who are you?" she demanded, a wave of confusion washing over her. The crowd murmured, eyes darting between Eleanor and the mysterious figure. "I'm your cousin," he declared, his voice steady despite the incredulity it elicited. "My name is Jack. William is my uncle too. You inherited his fortune, but there's something you need to understand." Gasps echoed through the park, and Eleanor felt her stomach twist. "What are you talking about? I've never heard of you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course you haven't," Jack retorted, frustration creeping into his tone. "William kept secrets, and now you're the guardian of those secrets. There's more to our family history than you realize. More than just wealth." Eleanor's mind raced. A cousin? She had never known of any relatives beyond the few she had met on rare occasions. "What kind of secrets?" she pressed, her curiosity piqued despite the unsettling nature of his revelations. Jack took a step closer, his expression serious. William was involved in things that went beyond philanthropy. There were business dealings, betrayals, things that could tarnish his legacy. You need to know what he was truly like, what he did to keep his fortune intact. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, expectant and intrigued. "This isn't the time or place for this," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm here to honor him." "And you should," Jack agreed, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "But you also need to confront the truth. If you don't, you might end up repeating his mistakes." Eleanor felt a weight settle on her shoulders. The statue stood behind her, a tribute to a man she was still trying to understand. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked, her voice steadier now, fueled by a resolve she didn't know she possessed. Jack studied her for a moment, as if weighing her sincerity. "Let's talk. There's a lot you don't know, and it's time you learned. You can't just walk away from this. Not now." The crowd was silent, the tension palpable. Eleanor glanced at the statue, then back at Jack. The familiar comfort of her quiet life in the small town felt distant now, overshadowed by the enormity of her great-uncle's legacy and the secrets intertwined with it. "All right," she said, taking a deep breath. "Let's talk." As she stepped down from the stage, the crowd began to disperse, whispers of disbelief swirling around her. Eleanor's heart raced, not just with fear, but with a burgeoning sense of purpose. This new journey awaited her, filled with uncertainties and revelations that could redefine everything she thought she knew about her family and herself. The future loomed ahead, mysterious and inviting, and Eleanor was ready to confront it.